Hey, my friends, I gave you a very brief thing when I first caught Candace Owens versus Piers Morgan. I wanted to unpack that for you some more because it's so important. Candace Owens, as you know, recently appeared on Piers Morgan's show, and she proclaimed Christ is king, that we should not be involved in constant global wars in Israel, Gaza, Ukraine, Russia, and slammed critics who were calling her anti-Semitic. You might have already seen Candace Owens take on Piers Morgan. She really took him to task on his show, on his own show. And I did first tell you about it, but I wanted to unpack it much better here since I'm finally back in the office. So I think he thought he was going to, have the upper hand. He's on his own territory, on his own show, but Candace was not having any of it. She was just unstoppable. She was stating hard truths and Catholic doctrine that the world needs to hear. And already she's got that message out to some 1.7 million people who have watched that interview. It was amazing. At one point, he goes after Candace for not condemning Hamas quickly enough or enthusiastically enough for his taste after the October 7th attack. And she defends herself so incredibly. She talks about how she's a Christian and the persecution against Christians, which is hardly ever covered anywhere. You've got to listen to her spiel. And as I said before, I think it should be memorized by all of us. Let's break it down. So, first of all, she says this, watch.
Now, to be clear, I am consistent on all matters. I do not want America involved whatsoever in anything that is happening in Israel. I don't want my dollars sent over to Israel. We should not be supporting Israel. Obviously, Thomas Massey has done a lot of work showing how it doesn't even make economic sense that we have so much debt and yet we're sending money over to support Israel.
Now, some of you might be wondering why LifeSite News has been taking such a hard line on Israel and the U.S.-Israel lobby. And Candace really hits the nail on the head there. In some ways, what she says is enough to explain why we at LifeSite should be concerned about what's going on in Gaza and in the U.S. government. We don't need any further reasons to be concerned, even though there are many. But that's not all. You're about to see Candace let it rip. Watch.
And the biggest issue, by the way, that I have with Israel in talking about them being above reproach is the fact that they are supplying the arms to murder Christians, okay? In Armenia, the oldest Christian country in the world, and yet nobody talks about that. For whatever reason, it seems to be the circumstance that when Jewish people die in Israel, it's wall-to-wall coverage. But when Christians die all over the world, nobody talks about it.
This is so true. And as I said, this is why LifeSite News always makes it a priority to report on the martyrdoms, killings, and persecutions that take place around the world on a daily basis. Just the other day, LifeSite's Andreas Welzer wrote about the Catholics murdered in Mozambique during the ongoing insurgency of militant Islamists in the region. Every now and then, a murder or even involuntary manslaughter becomes a cause célèbre in the mainstream media. But that never happened for Francisco Masaya in Nakuto, Mozambique, who was murdered by Islamic militants in 2022 in front of his own chapel, a holy, bloody sacrifice to God outside the place where the holy and unbloody sacrifice is offered every day. No one in the mainstream talks about Sister Maria de Copi, a Camboni missionary nun who was murdered there in a similar way. They don't tell you that when the Islamists arrived in Tatulu there, that they separated the locals, men and women, Muslims and Christians. And as some witnesses recalled, and I quote, when the first 3 Christians bravely came forward, they were tied up and beheaded, end quote. And on and on and on. But what is that about Armenia she was talking about? At the start of the 20th century, there was a lot of increased violence against Armenian Christians by the Islamic Ottoman Empire. This led to massacres, forced immigration and relocation, and the famous death marches. They'd turn up, take away the men, which included boys, by the way, march away and execute them by shootings or being pushed off cliffs, drowned, and so on. The women were killed less often, but you can imagine the specific sort of slavery they faced, along with forced conversion to Islam. Fast forward to the modern day, there have still been terrible conflicts between majority Muslim Azerbaijan and Armenia, and that's what Candace is talking about. Now listen, take a listen to this interview on a mainstream Israeli TV station with the Armenian ambassador.
Well, and joining us now for more is the Armenian ambassador to Israel, Arman Akopian, and he joins us from Tel Aviv. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. Though some of the details are secret, it's no secret that Israel does supply weaponry to Azerbaijan, which it sees as an ally. So what is your specific charge or criticism of Israel?
Well, these arms supplies to Azerbaijan during the Second Karabakh War and during the two escalations that followed it in last year and this year, we have reasons to believe that Israeli weapons were used very effectively and they contributed to the outcome of the Second Karabakh War. This is something that, of course, does not contribute to the strengthening and developing of our bilateral relations with Israel, something that we are very much determined to achieve.
Well, have you discussed this issue with Israeli officials? And if so, what kind of response do you get from them?
Well, they say that business is business, nothing personal. I don't think this is a very, convincing answer because we, in Armenia, we have since we have very strong empathy towards the Jewish people, we share a history of interaction going back to biblical times, and we are two people who suffered tremendous tragedies, two genocides, of the 20th century. In Armenia, there is this expectation that from the Jewish state, there will be more empathy towards the Armenian cause, more support for us. And I'm happy to say that on the level of public opinion, or the level of civil society, the civil society is overwhelmingly pro-Armenian, both in the case of Nagorno-Karabakh and the Armenian genocide recognition. And the state of Israel has yet to catch up with the people of Israel in sharing this attitude.
So that's what Candace was talking about. And yes, there's proof for it, but we're not going to be discouraged by that. As Tertullian said, and I quote, "The more you mow us down, the greater in number we grow, because the blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christians," end quote. Let's see what Candace has to say about the media, which refuses to take interest in all of this, and instead sends inquisitors like Morgan to ask her why she supposedly doesn't take on an interest in other atrocities. Watch. It is absolutely crucial that we do talk about what happened under the Soviets and other communist countries. Genrik Yagoda, who Candace just mentioned, was an official of the Soviet secret police and director of the NKVD, the Soviet intelligence agency. He was instrumental in the Great Purge in Russia and built canals with the political prisoner Gulag labor force. In one project alone, up to 25,000 Gulag prisoner slaves died. Many of them were Christians and were there because they were Christians. Yagoda, like Robespierre and so many of these hideous revolutionary cases, ultimately got eaten by his own revolution. He was summarily shot, which seems merciful compared to the agonizing deaths and slavery he caused through the Russian Gulag system. We have to know our history, because there can be no doubt that it is shaping up to be our future as well. Unless we know our history and prepare for tyranny now, will we be able to stand in the evil day when it comes? Let's go back to Candace. Watch.
I am tired of the media, exhausted of the media not speaking about what is happening to Christians all around the world. And it is especially horrific while at the exact same time that it is happening, the slaughter of Christians in Armenia, the arms being supplied by Israel, that the media turns the other way and says, oh, okay, but what about what about what's happening in Israel? So you know what I'm asking for? Actual equality. Okay, because it seems like this is like a special category, the special relationship that we have.
Boy, that is so true. Look, we at LifeSite News, like Candace, we condemn Hamas's killing of innocents and the taking of hostages on October the 7th. But we have to speak the truth in season and out of season. And also we need to remember that there are many Palestinian Christians in Gaza, as well, by the way, in the West Bank, which isn't even run by Hamas. And those Christians are being bombed to smithereens by Israel, the so-called most moral army on earth. Just a few weeks ago, I interviewed Khalil Sayeh, a young Palestinian Christian who had lost his 18-year-old sister because of what Israel is doing. He lost his dad and nearly lost his mom. We always have to speak the truth about injustice and the anti-Christian persecution, whether it's at the hands of Israel, Islamic persecutors, communists, or anyone else at all. Do you want to know why? Well, it's the same reason as Candace. Have a listen.
I'm a Christian first, okay? And so my concerns are going to be with what's happening to Christians all around the world, because it is us. We are the #1 most persecuted religion in the world. And all Christians watching this need to realize the time is now to start speaking up, because we have been silenced about the things that are happening to us for a very long time. And the media is very clearly not our friend. When there is wall-to-wall coverage of Christians being killed in Armenia, Christians being killed in Nigeria, and the treatment of Christians in America and all across the globe today, then you ask me if I will use my platform and I will use my voice to speak about what's happening in Israel. How about that?
Okay. I think that's a perfectly reasonable point to make.
Ouch. Perfectly reasonable indeed. Did you see how Piers had nothing to say? She really got him against the ropes there. Let's see what she said about this after the fact on her own show. Watch.
How about that, Piers? And I'll tell you how about it went. Well, he obviously ended that part of the conversation immediately, because there are aggressive double standards here. The idea that you can say to someone, why don't you use your platform to talk about this? And, you know, like I scrolled through Piers's feed, and it turns out that no, when Armenian Christians are being killed and being bombed, and it is a fact that Israel is supplying the arms to do that, Piers doesn't have anything to say. So why is he prioritizing Israel? He can't answer that question, so he wants to move on. It is constantly this effort to manipulate you into focusing your life and your attention on whatever they decide to press their thumbs down on. And it's not right. And that is my belief. I am a Christian. Of course, I'm going to use my Twitter feed. I'm going to dedicate my Twitter feed to things that are of interest to me. That is my right.
All power to Candace for speaking out loudly and forthrightly on these issues. And towards the end of the show, she really put her finger on the issue plaguing our society as well. And it's also, by the way, the solution to the problems plaguing our society. Listen to her.
We are weak right now. The West is weak right now. We're weak because we have men that are acting like women. We have journalists that don't have the strength to call out the truth, and they're calling everything a conspiracy theory. We have women who are no longer leading their households, women who are fearful of standing up for their children, the things that they know that are right or wrong for fear of being called a name.
And that is absolutely true. And that's why it's so important to watch and support independent media like LifeSite News, who do have the strength to call out these things. But that's not all. Listen to what she says is the solution.
We need to return to a time where people are guided by faith and by God and not by governments and the media institutions. We are weak. The West is failing. The West is falling. And the only way that we're going to be able to change that is if we start looking through things through an appropriate lens, right? The truth is that we lost the minute we turned away from faith and the minute that we turned away from God. That is my belief. And I don't put faith in institutions. I just don't. So I'm done with the military-industrial complex. I don't want to support Ukraine. I don't want to support Israel. I don't want to support any of it. I want to support my family And that is where everything begins, at home and in church.
But how do we return to God and to faith? We already know this, and while we don't need Candace to tell us, of course, it is just amazing that she's been able to state it to so many people in Morgan's audience. It's through the phrase she keeps getting into trouble for saying, Christ is king. I lost count of how many times she said it, and Morgan really tried to pummel her into submission with it. He was a bit, kind of cagey at first, but as it went on, it became clear that he was trying to get Candace to speak to her former colleagues' interview tour, in which he claimed multiple times that her saying Christ is king was anti-Semitic, and that she had been spitting it at Ben Shapiro, a high-profile Jewish person. Take a listen.
Right, a lot of attention has been focused on you constantly referencing Christ is king. Many people believing that although those words in themselves, if you're a Christian, as you are, would not be offensive, that to Jewish people, when they're being whipped up on social media, as they were at the time, by people who are genuine white supremacists and pretty brazen anti-Semites, that being smart as you are, you would have known that to deliberately use that phrase repeatedly in that time, in that climate, was a deliberate act of provocation to people like Ben Shapiro, who obviously are extremely high-profile Jewish people.
This section and Candace's answer were so important to Piers Morgan and his producers that it was made the key teaser for the preview at the start of the show, and along with some other edits and shots designed to make her look, kind of silly. That I thought was a low blow. It was a tactic. And anyway, Candace wasn't accepting Morgan's view of what happened. She returned to Andrew Klavan's role. Listen. But he got her on a roll, slamming the idea that this is a provocation.
I posted a standalone Bible verse and I wrote at the end of it, Christ is king. And then a Jew responded to me telling me to quit my job. So what happens sometimes is then time passes and people try to rewrite history, but we're not going to do revisionist history here. I tweeted Christ is king appropriately following a Bible verse when I was 38 weeks pregnant. And I stand by that proverb and I stand by my declaring Christ to be king, as I have done many times in the past, because it's basic Christian doctrine.
It is basic Christian doctrine indeed. But what is the doctrine? Like Candace said, it's the solution to what ails the West. The phrase Christ is king is usually recalling Pius XI encyclical, Creating the Feast of Christ the King. In that encyclical, he laid out clearly what Christ's kingship means and the traditional relationship between church and state. It's not about Christ's kingship at the end of time or his sovereignty over Christian hearts. It's about the ordering of civil society. The Pope taught, and I quote, "It would be a grave error to say that Christ has no authority whatever in civil affairs," end quote. That's because it's a truth of natural reason that civil power comes from God and that the state has a duty to recognize and worship him. And that this must be in accordance not with any old religion or none, but with the true religion, namely that of our Lord Jesus Christ and the Holy Catholic Church. So yes, that means that the state has a duty to recognize and worship Christ, to make the Catholic faith the state religion, and to make sure that all laws are in keeping with the natural and revealed moral laws. It means that the state does indeed have a role in helping us get to heaven. Just imagine a nation where that was happening. And because society has just thrown Christ and his church away, the Pope also taught that there is, and I quote, no really hopeful prospect of a lasting peace among nations. He said, those are his words, while, and I'm continuing to quote him, while individuals and states refuse to submit to the rule of our Savior, end quote. So that's what we mean when we say Christ is King. That's the basic Christian doctrine that Candace was talking about. Later on, Piers Morgan read out the words of Candace's former boss, Jeremy Boring, on why the phrase is anti-Semitic and compared it to a shovel that might be used for good or to kill someone. Man, you should hear what she said to that. This is another one to memorize. Watch.
I can't speak on behalf of Jeremy Boring. You'd have to book him, and he can talk more about his belief that Christ is King. It can be used like a shovel to murder people. You know, what I would say for me is I don't agree with that. And so if you find me saying Christ is King to be abhorrent, same thing. You don't have to support me. You don't have to follow me. But let me tell you, I'm going to continue to declare that Jesus Christ is the King of Kings.
So you can tell Piers Morgan did not like that. He started out talking about online commentator Nick Fuentes, whom he called a Holocaust denier and a white supremacist and a white nationalist. And he asked her about how she felt being supported by him and about using the same slogan of Christ is King as him. That's when she really put the nail in his coffin. That's where she poured out total scorn on the whole idea of being uncomfortable about Fuentes supporting her as if she was responsible for anyone else, and then doubled down. Listen.
If you are going to pointedly ask me if I am uncomfortable with the fact that Nick Fuentes also believes that Christ is King, I want every single person in the world to declare Christ is King, whether you believe them to be a Nazi, a white supremacist, a Jew, a Muslim. It is the phrase itself that I want declared, okay? That's it. That's it, okay?
And you know, he had nothing to say to this, nothing. So he changed the subject. It's so great to have these important Christian truths expressed on such a huge platform by someone of such high profile. It's really important that people like Candace and all of us speak out in season and out of season. Let's see just one more clip of her talking about that very topic of needing to speak out. Listen.
It's horrific to me that the media seems almost complicit in the dehumanization of Palestinians, and I will not be on that side because at the end of the day, the hit pieces, the name calling, the anti-Semitism, the psychopathic language that seems to be coming out of people means nothing. And I want to make sure everybody knows this, right? At the end of the day, you are going to have to account to God for the things that you allowed, for the things that you were complicit in, and for the things that you did not have enough courage to state.
Many people might just laugh at that last point, but that especially is a grace coming to them from God. It might be the first time that some people have ever even heard it, that they will be judged. They will continue to exist after their deaths, and they will be judged. This is the gospel, friends. And I think it's just amazing that in one fell swoop, Candace Owens has managed to take this okay, let me say that over again. And I think it's just amazing that in one fell swoop, Candace Owens has managed to take this very mainstream platform and preach so much truth about the endless wars, Christian persecution, the fact that each person will be judged, and that Jesus Christ is King. Well done, Candace. Viva Cristo Rey. For LifeSite News, this is John Henry Weston. May God bless you.